Let's do today. Oh yeah. Species of calculations. Move the lunch and
Anna Hep is absent. Derek is in the hizzy. Children, I have some announcements. Announcement number 1. There is an after-school environmental film Tuesday and Wednesday nights. What?
Okay, some days you show the same film on both days.
Same movie both days. And it's a very short one, which is rare. It's under an hour, just barely. Starting at 6, both days. It's like an episode of a nature documentary series from Oregon about invasive species. And since we're a lot like Oregon, we have the same invasive species, so it's sort of interesting that they're all ones that are invasive here. So it's cool about invasives. You should check it out. Tuesday and Wednesday, 6 p.m. here. Was anybody absent on Friday? Nobody here was absent on Friday. The post lab for Friday is due Tuesday next week. Please take out your field trip packet that you just grabbed in the back. So my field trips are not mandatory. They're very highly recommended. First of all, I try to make field trips that are just kind of like nice places to be. Second of all, they're definitely curricular. They cover stuff that's likely to be on the AP test that's tough to lecture on. So we leave during first period. We go to UCS Brodog. Walk around and check out some habitat restoration stuff. Check out some artificial wetlands, some real wetlands. We spend our lunch break at the beach. Listen very carefully to this. I am not planning water activities. However, we do take our lunch break at the beach. And I usually go swimming during my lunch break. So I take trunks and a towel, not planning on water activities, just in case I happen to fall into the ocean or something. Which seems to happen every year on this trip. Now I should be keeping you out of the water, but of course, I'm not a very good swimmer. And if we have any junior guards on this trip, then I can count on them to get you out of the water. Do we have any junior guards attending this trip? So you might want to bring bathing equipment just in case you fall into the water. You want to bring food and water. Comfortable shoes, sun protection, layers, because the temperatures change quickly at UCS Bro. I know it's possible to buy food on that campus, but I won't allow you to buy food on that campus. There's a bunch of reasons. So please make sure that you bring something. There's no other access to food on this trip. If everybody's disciplined and we move quickly, we can get like a pretty good lunch session of relaxing at the beach, and that's a really nice way to spend our lunch. We do a little bit more walking around and looking at other stuff afterward. There's 1 or 2 stops while we're on the bus. One going in, one coming out. I believe that is the end of my description. You're excused periods 1 through 5. I'll see you at the flagpole next Monday. We'll be back in time for you to go to period number 6 where you are not excused. Please look at that packet. You fill in number 1 and 2 on the front. If you prefer Espanol, it's an Espanol on the back. Then the second page, you bring on Monday. That's your bus ticket. The first page, the medical release thing, I need that this Friday. You can see it's on the board. Field trip paper this Friday. The second part where the teachers sign up, you can actually bring on Monday next week. That's your bus ticket. That gets you on the bus. Yes?
Can we put it in the
No, I actually need you to keep it separate because that's how I take attendance that way. Any other questions? Last call. I hope you're psyched. Field trips are nice. It's a really good one. The stuff that we see is pretty tough to lecture on, but pretty neat to see in place. We talk about a lot of different topics in this unit on that trip. All right then. Is this period 3? This is period 3, right? Remember that this Wednesday, you're not going to be in this room at this time doing this. After you complete your PSAT Sufferfest, you've got like a day and a half to come see one of my other classes, or in the worst case, to try to watch our video on the interweb. I think I have fixed the volume problem. If you'd be willing to watch today's video to let me know, that'd be great. I just fixed it last Friday. Hopefully you'll be able to watch the YouTube as one option if you can't come to periods 5, 2, or 4 on Wednesday afternoon or Thursday this week. How many of you plan to rearrange your other classes to come visit 5, 2, or 4? How many of you think you'll have to resort to the YouTube? All right. Let's finish biomes. Biome notes. Get $10 out of my wallet in the armrest of my Tacoma. Then on the way back, bring me that SAT box that's on top of the empty pen. It's labeled SAT.
Okay.
Did we already? What?
Wait, what?
Did we already talk about chaparral? Yes? Then you know, first of all, that it's the red stuff. You know that our plants are all evolved to the suffering of our extended hot, dry season, which is unusual globally, yes or no? Did you already explain why it's super waxy and dusty looking? Talk about fire renewal communities? Yeah? Did we talk about the rarity of your biome and why it's such a big deal for places like the Gaviota Coast to be developed? Something I forgot to mention, by the way. Happy go to a stranger's house and steal it and call it your house day.
Columbus Day.
Oh, right. Also known as go to someone else's house and steal it and call it your house day.
We don't murder them.
So what now?
You have to murder them first.
Yeah, I guess we might.
Did you want me to do this?
Perfect.
Oh, leave it here?
Hey, can I make a suggestion as a fellow Italian? We got a lot of good Italians to celebrate. Alright. Sorry, I should have said that in the announcement, but anyway. Did we talk about grassland yet?
Yeah.
Oh, we did?
I think we got all the beer boxes.
Whoa! No way, okay. So we talked about the first animal driven to the brink of extinction and an act of genocide?
Yeah.
All right! Wow, bravo, bravo! Did we talk about tropical rainforest?
No.
Oh, no, yeah.
Wow, this is my favorite class. I love you, kid. 3 hugs.
We love you too, Jose.
Also that. I love you for being so boring. Tropical rainforest is the dark green stuff. There's South American dark green stuff and the Heart of Darkness dark green stuff. And then the Asian dark green stuff. You all know that it's tropical and it's rainy? Yes or no? You all know that the day lengths are all the same? Because it's in the equator. So that's a very consistent environment which favors specialness. Have we talked about that?
No.
No? Check this out. I will give you a marketing analogy. Imagine that I'm a mechanic in Santa Barbara. I operate a Jiffy Lube. There's 3 or 4 other Jiffy Lubes. Competing with a generic mechanic is really costing me a lot because I got to keep making sales to fight against the other guy's sales, and I got to really fight to find my niche in this business world because there's a lot of competition, and competition sucks. So I choose to specialize. I'm going to just work on Toyotas. Does that make sense to everybody? If I can work on Toyotas, I can probably get better at that than the competition. So no Toyota owner wants to take it to Jiffy Lube when they can take it to Caballero's Toyota specialty mechanic shop. Does that make sense to you? So to avoid competition, I can specialize in Toyotas. Does that make sense? What do I need from Santa Barbara in order for me to specialize in Toyotas? A lot of Toyotas. And they got to be regular Toyota owners, right? It can't be like next week there's no more Toyota owners, because then it would suck to be a specialist in Toyotas if there's no more Toyotas in Santa Barbara. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
So check this out. The tropical rainforest is like a greenhouse. It's perfect. It's warm, it rains every day, there's the same amount of sunlight every day, so it's super productive. The plants really have almost no limit on their growth. But of course, neither do their neighbors, and so competition is a big challenge. Look at how much competition these plants must face. Competition is a challenge. So thank God that the tropical rainforest is so consistent. You can break off a very specialized little niche, and that's probably going to be there tomorrow, and it's probably going to be there the day after. There are frogs that only live in little water puddles inside of one species of bromeliad at the top of the canopy. That's their whole niche. Why compete with all the other frogs? There's always going to be rain, so there's always going to be rain puddle because there's always bromeliads, there's always going to be rain puddles and bromeliads. So boom, that's their niche. They don't hang out with the other frogs, they don't compete with the other frogs, they just sit in their little rain puddles and wait to eat insects that fly by. Bingo. That's a very obscure, specialized frog species, but you can do that if you can depend on the rain puddles in the bromeliad. It's interesting to point out, like it says at the bottom, that all the nutrients are locked up in plant. Because you know, there's always enough water, there's always enough sunlight. So those plants are just waiting for nutrients. A key surprise for my students is when I show you this image, it turns out that the soil underneath those plants is horrible. It's the worst. As soon as those dead leaves decompose, and you know, good temperatures, a lot of water, a lot of sunlight, they're going to decompose really fast. As soon as those things decompose, they're going to get soaked up into plants. All those plants are like, come on, come on, come on, come on, I'm ready to grow, I'm ready to grow, I'm ready to grow. They're just waiting for the nutrients. This is why they do slash and burn agriculture in the tropics, because the soil sucks. But you can take all that biomass, cut it down, and turn it into ashes to fertilize the soil. Look at that density. So much life, so specialized. You're looking at like 1,000 species or something. Huh? I went to a place in Guatemala that looked just like this. It was gnarly. It was super gnarly. Look at the density. There's plants growing on plants that are growing on plants. They layer up. So there's the plants that poke through the canopy, the plants that make up the canopy, the plants that are halfway down to the ground, there's all the terrestrial ones, and usually there's a whole set of biodiversity that lives underneath the leaf litter or in little pockets in the sand. Remember that all that water moving through is going to take away any dissolved nutrients that don't get used up by plants, but there's just such a surplus of water that usually there's just nothing left in that soil. And you've got to know this. Consistent, productive, specialized, layered. Consistent, productive, specialized, to avoid competition, you know, and layered. What's interesting is each of these layers of the tropical rainforest ecosystem is basically its own ecosystem. There are decomposers, producers, primary, secondary, tertiary, and peak consumers in basically each of these layers. So there's like the predators that are under the leaves, and then the predators that are like at knee height, and the predators that like run along the branches, and the predators that hunt up at the top, and there's even predators that eat from above. So neat. Yeah, wacky frogs, wacky birds, wacky spiders. Someday when we're bored, you should ask me to tell you my tropical tarantula story. It's a good one. I almost died. There's an interesting paradox in the tropics that you also need to know about. There's a ton of laws that protect the tropics, and nobody there to enforce those laws. It's so remote. You saw the countries that had tropics, right? These are not the wealthiest superpowers on Earth. Imagine being some cop who had to buy his own uniform 300 miles from cell reception and asphalt, and you run into a band of armed illegal miners or illegal loggers or illegal hunters or illegal ranchers or whatever. What are you going to do? Like, nobody can hear you scream. And it's just a numbers thing. It pays to be a criminal there. It doesn't really pay to be in law enforcement. You're so far away that you're in the smaller team if you're in law enforcement. We have a really sad and tragic reality in the tropics. Everybody's like, why doesn't Brazil just make it illegal to cut down the trees? It's been illegal to cut down the trees since like the 60s. But you want to go down there and enforce those laws? Go for it. Go buy your own ammo. See how that goes for you. It's rough. So you know what's crazy? This is one of like the epicenters of the human slave trade. People eat pretty much whatever they can find. A lot of your like fancy exotic pets come from these environments, not legally harvested. There was a time when all the beautiful exotic parrots in the United States were from the wild. Even today, a lot of exotic parrot species are only from the wild. Very difficult to breed. Fish, you know, like aquarium fish? All like the little tetras that are all like colorful and small. Those are actually really hard to breed, but they're really easy to go net. Gold! 1/2 of the United States gold comes from an illegal mine. Okay. Anyone want to talk more tropical rainforest? Warning, warning, warning. Did your book mention monsoon forest? You did? Be careful. Monsoon forest is a microbiome, not really its own biome. Only kind of its own biome because it has one weird thing.
Monsoons.
The monsoons.
Take this.
Open it. Monsoon forest is on the coast right along the equator. So that's a monsoon forest, that's a monsoon forest. I think somewhere in here is a monsoon forest, and somewhere over here, one of those is a monsoon forest. But there's not a lot. Just like chaparral is coastal at 35 degrees, monsoon forest is coastal just off the equator. And it's just like chaparral, extended dry season with a few rains, except we're in the tropics. So the extended dry season is tropical dry. And then when you get a rain, it's tropical rain, which means non-stop rain, like sometimes for 6 weeks, no break. I don't mean every day, I mean like 24/7 for 6 weeks. That's a lot of rain. We're talking really extreme rains. Some of you have heard that Bangladesh has this like annual drowning season because a lot of Bangladeshis live in coastal slums, and when they get hit by the monsoon, there's so much runoff coming off land and so many stormy conditions on the coastline that there's just like a season where coastal poor in Bangladesh just get washed out to sea, and like hundreds of people die every year during the monsoon floods. Coincidentally, considered to be some of the worst quality of life. If you're the poorest person, you're right on the coast there. Check it out, that's your monsoon forest. I should point out that this is a small biome. A lot of people don't really call it its own biome. It's just the place where this weird weather event happens called a monsoon. Probably the one thing you should write down in your notes about monsoon, other than the weather thing, is that this represents one of the possibilities for future human farming. This is a place that we don't farm now, where people have argued maybe we should start to farm. Use reservoirs, trap that monsoon rain, and then create tropical farmland here. If there's one you can't figure out, let me know when you've made a pile of them. At least sort them by like kind.
Okay.
Also these. Next, this is tropical grassland. Remember how we talked about grassland last time? A place that has like rains every season? Now imagine just rain in 2 seasons, but more rain when it happens. So a big summer rain and a big winter rain. That's tropical savanna. It's the salmon-colored pink stuff here. Salmon-colored pink stuff. It's tropical. It's in the center of the continents. Summer rain and winter rain. So you can imagine it's like tropical conditions, and then all of a sudden the rain starts, and you're going to get a big burst of productivity right when those rains hit. If you've ever seen documentaries with like elephants and water buffaloes and like hyenas and lions and cheetahs and giraffes and zebras, that's what we're talking about. Savannah. All my photographs suck. I don't know why. I've got such nice slideshows and these ones are all horrible. That's the only nice photo I've got. This one's all like fuzzy focus and that one's even worse. Hey, y'all know Tobias Cole? Him and his sister and his mom and his dad go out most summers to Uganda, I believe. And after they do their like community work in Uganda, they've often gone to various parts of the savannah to enjoy like. So they've probably got some killer photos. Sorry that mine sucks so bad. That's a nice one. But you can imagine it's just a grassland that all the productivity happens at once. And just like our grassland had the big herbivorous bison, there are big herbivores in the African savanna too. But the secret is the African savanna has a bunch of herbivores that survived the last ice age. So there's a lot of them. And I want to talk about this one. Does everybody know what that is? What can you make with those 2 wacky teeth?
Beautiful things.
Piano keys, crazy keychains, knife handles, random carvings, statues. You can powder them, and they're supposed to help you be more of a man, I believe. Or maybe not, but I think that's what is that what it's for? The Eastern medicine applications of ivory tusk, powdered ivory tusk. Whatever. Walrus also has ivory tusks, but those are crappy compared to the ones you get off an African elephant, which are really, really big. Shut up. Sorry. Just kidding. Fun fact, my closest friend just inherited his grandfather's ivory collection. His grandfather was like a civil engineer or something. He was a civil engineer in Africa. And so when he traveled around Africa, like during like the 50s and the 60s, my homie's grandfather collected this amazing pile of ivory. He's got, I don't even know, like a garage full of ivory. Grandfather dies, my closest friend inherits this gigantic pile of ivory that's now contraband. It's probably worth millions. My best friend's school teacher like me. He's broke like me. He's got 2 kids like me. He's got a nice wife that doesn't make any money like mine. And so he's looking at his inherited ivory and he's like, what do I do with this? What if somebody gave you $2 or $3 million of something that's contraband? What would you do? So he tried to sell it and he couldn't. And he's like sitting on $2 or $3 million of contraband, and he's probably just gonna like donate to some museum or something. When his grandfather bought it, it wasn't illegal, but of course now it's become illegal because in the 1970s we made it illegal to sell ivory. It's called the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, CITES. And nowadays you can't can't unload all that ivory. Abby, are you taking all these notes on what I'm saying, or are you doing homework for another class? What? Both?
Yep.
I like half that. Interesting thing about the elephant, you know, when we protected them, their population started to spike. But you all remember who had those big chunks of grassland and who didn't? Watch. Which continent has the least orange?
Africa.
Africa has the least orange. When I was your age, my mom used to say, finish your dinner, they're starving children in Africa. Of course, they're starving children everywhere. But when I was your age, man, Africa was going through some extreme food shortages. So you know, during the Cold War, Russia became like a global superpower by exporting all of its grain. Look at how much orange Russia has. Fast forward to a couple of years ago. Watch this amazing sequence of events. Climate change, shift in the temperature of the Atlantic, a drop in water vapor going to the Eurasian jet stream, drought in Russia, Russia stops exporting grains. All those starving children in Africa were addressed by Russia's extra grain until Russia stopped sending out that extra grain. Starting it right around the year 2012, 2013, when the elephants had made a rapid recovery, people throughout the savannah, you see all that pink stuff there in Africa? People throughout Africa's savannah show up at the supermarket and they're like, what do you mean a loaf of bread costs $11? That used to be like 80 cents, bro. And they're like, yeah, but we can't get grains out of Africa anymore, so out of Russia anymore, so prices have all skyrocketed. So all these folks in Africa go, I can't afford to feed my kids. Where am I gonna find a whole bunch of cash in a hurry? I can remember how we talked about how all those places have a lot of laws of not a lot of enforcement. Well, you know, like sub-Saharan Africa is kind of like that too. So here comes a crazy thing. The richest period in ivory poaching was not when my best friend's grandfather made his collection. It was right around 2012 to 2015, 2016. The only reason that the ivory trade has slowed down lately is because we're pretty much running out of elephants again. You all know which part of the world just made a whole lot of money in the early 2000s leading up to about 2015? Which part of the world got really big? Donald Trump is not a fan.
Oh.
China. And you know, people with a lot more cash will seek access to more things that show your wealth. And as China has a lot more disposable income, they're like, yo, bring us all that ivory stuff. And there's all these folks in Africa that are like, wait, you'll pay for this? Because I really need the bread. And meanwhile, the rest of the world's like, no, not the elephants, not the elephants. And everybody's in China like, yeah, but I can afford it. And everybody in Africa is like, yeah, but I need to sell it. So it's been a really interesting challenge for conservation in the savannah. Okay. Savannah is mostly undisturbed because humans don't like it there. Unless you have access to water, you really can't do much there. Interesting to point out that you have lived through the peak of elephant poaching, which I think is really sad and interesting. You know, you're supposed to live in a world after that. We should have finished poaching before I was born. When I was a kid, nobody was killing the elephants. My dad was in South Africa the day that Nelson Mandela got out of prison, and everybody was celebrating in the streets, and somebody offered my father like a piece of commemorative carved ivory. And he was like, well, I really want to commemorate this event, but even my dumbass dad knew not to buy ivory. Because ivory's like not, like, no. Just now, recent events. Pretty clearly tied to climate change, by the way, have led to the spike in poaching. Hey, isn't it interesting to talk about human affairs through biomes? Am I the only guy that thinks this is neat? Nobody else thinks this is neat. Say yes loud, bit.
Yeah.
All right, now dessert. Dessert is the white stuff. You'll notice something interesting about deserts. They are at the center of their continents. You see how they're all protected by coastlines for the most part? There's a little exception across Africa. In the, what is that, the Arab Peninsula? Is that what it's called? Am I saying that right?
Arabian.
Arabian Peninsula? Thanks. I knew I wasn't saying it right. But most of them are protected by coastlines. Usually they have a little outlet to the ocean somewhere, but most of it's protected by coastlines. You should know that desert is the world's largest biome. As a percentage, this is the most common. And you should know that sand dunes are not deserts. There's very, very few deserts that are sand dunes. Sand dunes are really not that common. Everybody thinks that the desert is just sand, but it ain't. There are very, very, very few places. Those are usually where a desert is close to the coastline, where the desert comes out to the sea. Depending on which way it faces or something, they're very rare. It's very, very few. Confusion alert. Deserts are dry, but not like you're used to. What's more interesting in a desert is not the amount of water, but the extremes of temperature and the spacing of the water. There's frequent little sprinkles, but temperature goes up and down all day, every day. Boom, 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 boom. Spike up, spike down, spike up, spike down. You gotta know that. Extreme temperature variation, like boom, 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 boom. Pretty much daily rain. You get a lot of nocturnal life because the day sucks so much. You have a lot of adaptations to water storage. And read that thing at the bottom about the soil. Probably want to try to paraphrase that, but I'm going to talk for a little bit so you can think about which parts you want to copy down. Look at today's warm-up. If you leave like a glass of water in the garage and you go back 6 months later and you find it, what's on the inside of your glass of water that you forgot and all the water evaporated out? What do you have left on the inside of that glass? Mineral deposits, those little white rings. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Cool. Now imagine. It rains on rocks, and those rocks dissolve. Remember, it's not sand dune for the most part. Sand dune is rare.
Okay.
This is desert. Rains on rocks, those minerals dissolve, and every day the temperature is going to get really hot, so that water evaporates and dissolved minerals build up in the soil. So you see that white? Kind of see some white here. See that white there? That's a special soil type only found in deserts. It's like a dry sponge of those little mineral deposits like you've got on the glass, but I'm talking like 1 inch or 2 inches thick. It's so difficult to explain unless we can go to the desert, but I've got one experience that will work for about 10% of you. There's these green sponges that old ladies use to arrange flowers. Like, God forbid your grandmother dies, but when she does, I'll bet you she has some of that in a closet somewhere for Arts and Crafts Day for old ladies. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Tidy. That green sponge that the old ladies used to, and by the way, was it an old, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Keep your hand up if it was old ladies arranging flowers. Okay. How did you know about it, Derek? You also arrange flowers?
No, my mom used to be a florist.
Ah, okay, well, pretty close. Those dry green sponges, that's just like this white crystal matrix. Think about it. They're very delicate, so when you just brush those green sponges with your finger and the powder falls apart. It's very light, and it's very, very, very porous, because this is made of little spontaneously crystal stacking mineral deposits. So it's like a dry sponge. When it rains, it absorbs water, and when everything dries out in the desert, imagine the desert around this, when everything's all dry, that sponge retains water. They house microbes, and so this spongy stuff, please look up, this spongy stuff does this to start this. The difference between these deserts and the sand dunes is these got started with all of their biomass buildup using the secret ingredient of deserts, the biotic soils. They're called cryptogamic. There's like a whole list of terms in your study guide, right? Was that in your study guide, or am I making this up?
Biological soil crusts.
Yeah, biological soil crusts. There's like a generic list of terms. Biological soil crust is like a generic term. There's a whole bunch of really specific types. So there's fungus-rich soils, bacteria-rich soils. There's a name for the ones that are sprouting and the ones that haven't sprouted yet. But these are biological soil crusts. They're the secret. They're what turns a sand dune into a living desert.
How do we define it?
It's the dried up crystal matrix when you evaporate water but accumulate minerals. Here, it might be right there. Crystalline matrix of minerals that bind together sand. Yeah, and house microbes. There you go. That's your biological soil crust. Yeah?
So does it actually rain minerals? Because if they don't evaporate, how do the minerals get there?
Remember that, well, maybe you don't know this already, that all rain is slightly acidic because there's carbon dioxide in the air, and carbonic acid is made when you use oxides in water, when you combine oxides in water. So any oxides in the air will make acids in the rainfall. Carbon dioxide is always in the air, so carbonic acid is always in rainfall. All rain is acidic. Knowing that all rain is acidic, you know that rocks are going to dissolve a little bit when rain falls on those rocks. So runoff in the desert has minerals in it. Rocks are just naturally dissolving everywhere on the planet when they're hit by a slightly acidic rain. And so rainfall dissolves rock, and those remaining dissolved minerals will crystallize when the water evaporates away into these little dry sponges, like those flower arranging sponges that Derek's mom used to use for her job. And every other old lady uses for crafts. Those retain water, they trap seeds, they start the party the same way that lava rock does. Yeah?
I'm not sure if this is the same thing, but I've noticed sometimes at the beach, if the sand sits for a while and you like walk across it, it'll kind of break into little like plates that are sort of held together. Is that?
That is
similar?
exactly the same thing, except keep in mind that where that happens, that's only the salt water retreating on a hot day. So the amount of water that evaporates and leaves a very small percentage of salt, you're looking at like literally one evaporation event. So that is enough to bind the sand, but not for very long, right? Even the wind will break those apart.
Right.
How many of you realize that that's the same thing, what he's talking about with the salt crust at the beach? So imagine if you just did that over and over and over again, but nothing else was moving the sand. After like 2,000 years, you get that. Eventually the sand can leave and the minerals stay. That's what you see there, it's just the exposed mineral sponge. You know what's crazy? There's places in the American Southwest where you can do archaeology research on the tracks of the crust, where you can see the wagon train and how many people were walking. And trackers go out there and they're like, oh look, you can see that Ma sprained her ankle because now she's limping. Because you can see in the tracks, they're like, oh, now she's a little lopsided, or putting more weight on the toes or whatever. They do all this stuff about monitoring migrations by looking at the place where you still have tracks. Do you all know that the first tanks were developed for World War I? So there's a place in the American Southwest where you can still see the tracks of the first tank. It's like, there's like it's cordoned off with like little ropes. And you can go and it's like a display and they're like, this is where the first, and those are still there because that's super delicate. That's why all the hippies get pissed about off-road vehicles in the desert, because we're turning it into sand dunes. Interest? Yes, he's interested? Not really. Water storage. Do you all know that cactus have needles not to protect them from predation as much as it is to trap condensation? Needles are in a little cluster, and there's always a curved one at the bottom of the cluster. So they build their own raindrops and water themselves around the base. Isn't that cool? Nocturnal. Water storage. Water collection. Do you all know what that is?
Thorny devil?
Thorny devil! Bravo! Are you Australian by any chance?
No.
How did you know? Herpetology dork?
I guess, yeah.
Alright, I guess you are. Yeah, me too. It's cool. You're safe, bro. The thorny devil drinks by walking out in the morning. It sits there and lets its body cool off all night, and then it walks out. And you know how like warm, misty air on a cold surface makes condensation? Like if you take a soda can into the shower, it gets all the droplets on the outside of the soda can. So the thorny devil will go from its cool place out into the morning, warm, moist sunrise environment, sit there until it builds up condensation on its body, and then it picks up its tail to start a snowball effect of water that rolls down those two gutters on the side. It will trap like a droplet on each side, and then it turns its head sideways and sticks its tongue out and drinks its morning beverage off its back, trapping condensation the same way that cactus does.
Wow.
Glories of Jah! Isn't this amazing, the stuff that your planet does? I was never impressed. Alright, humans don't like it, it's really big. Most of it is intact, and humans have very, very little interaction with it. We've got one biome left and then it's done. But you need a lot of notes on our last biome. The final biome from our slideshow is wetlands. You're going to need a lot of notes on wetlands. Wetlands are ecologically super critical. The most criticalist Wetlands occur everywhere on the map, any place that is sometimes land and sometimes wet. Wetland. Sometimes land and sometimes wet. If you think about it, you know, shallow surface water that's run across land is going to have a lot of nutrients in it. So you've got like sunlight, nutrient-rich water, silt and sediment. It's shallow, so it's warm. These are super productive. And you should know that they're also super variable. You know, it's a wetland, so sometimes it's land and sometimes it's wet. That's a dynamic system. It's not stable. Most wetlands don't stay wet all year. We'd call those lakes or rivers or something. Wetland is the part that changes from wet to dry. So these are dynamic systems. Y'all know like coastal estuaries, like Arroyo Burro Beach? That like little swampy lagoon that's sometimes freshwater, sometimes saltwater. This is a good visual. It's very dynamic. Sometimes it dries out, sometimes it's full of fresh water. Later that afternoon, they'll get a big rush of cold salt water. Very dynamic. And utterly critical to many, many animals. I'll explain. Even that is a wetland. It's just a puddle in the middle of the prairie. But this is an estuary wetland. This is a cypress swamp wetland. Yeah.
What's an estuary?
A place where salt water meets fresh water on a coastline. This is a mangrove swamp. The College Board always asks about mangroves. It's a type of tree that lives on the tropical coast. And they're adapted for living in salt water. It's a tree that lives in salt water. That's a big deal. Check it out, they make snorkels. Their roots make tubes that break through the surface of the water to get gases down to the roots. So mangroves make snorkels from their root mass. Now look, if you need to understand why this is so critical to biodiversity, imagine that environment. Shallow water, a lot of nutrients, silt and sediment. Look at how much stuff can grow, like algae and like moss and little aquatic plants. Imagine all the insects that could eat all of that stuff in that shallow water. If you've ever seen something like this, I'll bet you when you saw it, it was full of bugs. Now imagine if a fish could come from the ocean and leave its babies here. That's a really safe place for that little fish to grow up and eat, right? So it's called the nursery effect for fish. Because high productivity, a lot of insects, great place to leave a baby fish, the nursery effect. Like, you know, where humans leave the baby to be safe and warm. Nursery effect for fish. Now imagine if you're a migratory bird. Highly productive aquatic system with a bunch of aquatic plants if you're a duck, a bunch of aquatic insects if you're another type of water bird, and a bunch of little baby fish if you're a piscivorous bird. So wetlands are super critical to migratory birds. And they're super critical to humans. They do a lot of stuff for humans. I'm glad you're taking notes. They slow flooding. They filter runoff. They recharge groundwater. Oh, and if they're coastal, they protect you from storm surges. It's like a sponge in the sink. How many of you either wash the dishes or have watched your butler do your dishes for you? So at my house, when I watch my butler do my dishes, I'm like, Jeeves, could you hurry up, please? And Jeeves goes, yes, sir, right away, sir. I always notice that Jeeves has a sink full of soapy, scummy water, and where he scrubs off all the plates, and then he rinses them, and then they go into the dish rack. But when my butler pulls the drain on the sink, if he left the sponge will block the drain. That slows the movement of water, preventing flooding. That filters my runoff, so the water going into the drain is cleaner because the sponge fills up with all the scum from the sink, right? That will recharge groundwater, because later on that night, the sponge will continue to dribble out a little bit of water over a longer period of time, right? That's called a sponge effect. Everything I just said is right there. Not to mention the stopover pit stop for migratory birds and the nursery value for fishies. If you couldn't figure out which notes you were supposed to take, R&I and Nice Guy Georgia Brace, now that you're finally ready with the paper like a normal high school kid,
Yes.
These are really nice places for humans to live, because they're, you know, like there's water and land nearby. They're also really nice places to farm, because they're very productive and have good soils. So there's not a lot of wetlands left, and this is like one of the most important places to fix up. These are the habitats that we're trying to restore. We're done with the tour of biomes. You've got to know restoration target heavily impacted. You've got to know the nursery effect, migratory bird, sponge effect. We did all the biomes. Period 3 is my favorite, the only period that's finished. Wow. Does anybody need me to flip these around at all? Yeah? You shouldn't. You're asking me about, like, theoretically, will the new